So this is the third in the kind of vaguely copyright and licensing related sessions that we've done for the Researcher and HDR Student Workshop series. So this one today is Data Do, not Data Don't, Data Access Management and Sharing. So before we go any further, though, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country. So the University of Newcastle acknowledges the traditional custodians of the unceded lands within our footprint areas. That's the Awabakal, Darkinjung, Biripi, Worimi, Wonnarua and Eora nations. We also pay respect to the wisdom of elders past, present and emerging, and would like to extend this acknowledgement and pay respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us here today or watching the recording later on YouTube. So yes, if you do feel comfortable, please feel free to acknowledge the lands that you're on in the chat. We will be monitoring chat as part of the session today. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Please keep your microphones muted during the session just to make sure we don't get any kind of noise bleed from anywhere. No, children or pots boiling or anything like that, kettles I should say. So there will be options to ask questions throughout. We'll pause every so often, so you can unmute at those times if you'd like to, or you can also pop your questions into the chat and we can read them out for you as we go. As I mentioned, the session is being recorded and it's going to go up into YouTube, and all of the registrants will receive a copy of the link to YouTube, and also I like to include a copy of the slides that I use. I use Canva, so they're all online, and you can get access to all the various links and things that we'll be discussing today. So as I mentioned, this session is Data Do, Data Don't, not Data Don't. We do have 2 previous sessions if you'd like to go check them out on our YouTube channel, and they'll be provided as links when you receive your email. So on the 25th of August, we did Getting Copyright Right in Your Research. And on the 1st of September, we did presentations and papers and posters, oh my, dealing with conference copyright. So please go and check those out as well. All right, so I'm going to hand over to now, I think this one's Nicole, you're kicking us off, great. So I'll mute myself. And like I said, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat as we go along. And it's not gonna let me mute, there we go. Okay, Nicole, go for it.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Anthony. So I'd like to start today's, discussion and investigation looking at what is data research. So when we're talking, research data. So when we're talking about research data, we're talking about basically anything that you may use from which to derive an outcome. So it could be facts, it could be observations, it could be images, it could be recording, it could be program results, measurements, how long's a piece of string. So please, anything that you use, so a few others, could be interviews and transcripts, it could be search results, they could be specimens, field observations, GIS data. So there's a whole lot of different types of things that it could be in terms of when we're talking about research data, what it actually means. So in terms of its format, it could be numerical, descriptive, visual, or tactile. So it's not necessarily just your good old standard spreadsheet with stuff in it. And this data may also be raw, so i.e. fresh off wherever it's come from. It might be cleaned, i.e. you've tweaked some stuff that to make it easier to process, and it could be processed, i.e. then you've gone through and derived some outcomes from that. And it can also be held in any format or media, so it doesn't have to be something that's in a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet. It could be an audio file, it could be something else. So the thing too that we need to think about is in relation to that, it could also be something that you've put together as a result of other things. So a couple of things to think about and understand is that the uni actually has an existing policy around research data, so the responsibilities for researchers. So please have a look if you're not too sure about what your responsibilities are, or whether you have, especially if you haven't looked at it for a little while. It's quite important that you do understand that so that there's no, issues later. To help you out with managing your data and putting together your project, we actually have what we call a data management dashboard, and it allows you to create an electronic data management plan, which also includes archiving and publishing aspects to it as well, and considers things like research data. You can add descriptive information. We've had some challenges in the last few weeks with our data management dashboard, but as far as I'm aware at the moment, it's up and running again, and you should be able to implement your plan. One thing to remember about the data management dashboard is it can be updated. It's not something that you do once and you can't make any changes. You can update it, especially if elements of the project might change. So for example, you suddenly come up with a few other things that you hadn't necessarily initially thought might happen, and then there might be some more files, there might be a few more images, there might be a few more outcomes that you hadn't kind of necessarily expected. It's a happy surprise type thing. So please don't feel that you can't go back in. Or sometimes some of the details, so things like archiving isn't something you're going to be able to do at the beginning of the project. You might just have to wait a bit till you've got something to archive, and in terms of what's the best way to do that. So the other thing too is please, with any of your open data, consider adding it to our Nova repository. So that's the institutional repository. And you can also add other content as well, so articles and research products. So really important to consider that, so people can get access to your information, or at least a record if it's not able to be made fully available. The other thing to, while you're adding stuff, requesting it to go into the Nova repository, also please consider adding a record to your Neuro profile so it can go up on Nexus. So really important that if that information is and also is included, and it then can be acknowledged on your website, in the website profile for you. If it is a non-traditional research output, please consider having it evaluated from that side, and Kai Chan's the best person to check out whether it meets those criteria or not. So if I flip the coin just slightly and looking away from the university, but the people who give us the money in the first place, such as governments and other people, there is a real importance for checking requirements. So when you sign a funding agreement, there's all sorts of little bits and pieces and responsibilities that come along with that. So please, the presentation will be included as part of the email that, as Anthony mentioned, will be sent out after this. Please check out the Australian Code for Responsible Conduct of Research, and that basically has 8 principles for undertaking research in terms of the responsibilities, including some of them, for example, are honesty, transparency and accountability, among others. So there's all sorts of things under that. Also note that researchers retain the data arising from funded outputs, but really it's really lovely if you're able to share where possible. The other thing too is that the ARC has research data management requirements as well, and I can also help outline the best ways to manage, store, disseminate and reuse data. So i.e. thinking about it for the longer term and being able to, the potential of using that data again. One thing to note too is that you may have seen recently that there has been some updates to the Nh Mrc in terms of the requirements for data in relation to funded projects for them. It needs to be made available immediately after publication. There's no 12-month embargo anymore. So if I slip on to a slightly different looking at, I guess, one of the a more specific aspect of data research, looking at the Indigenous component of that. While we can still do a lot of things, there's a few other bits and elements that we do need to consider. So please, if you are working with the Indigenous community, it needs to be shared with care and ethical considerations. The Indigenous people have a right to have a say in the ways of managing their cultural heritage in meaningful ways, not just a tick the box thing. We do really need to be careful on that front. The university has an Indigenous education and research framework which was put together in 2021, which gives you some big picture ideas. And as part of that, which will complement that, is ICIP protocol, which will actually be gives you more, I guess, descriptive and some greater assistance in terms of working with the Indigenous community in relation to with data collection and engaging with them in this aspect. At the moment, that is still under development. So please, if you are working in that field and you would like to know what will fall under that and what sort of responsibilities you have, please reach out to your research liaison librarian and we can with the help of Anthony, talk you through what's in there. But unfortunately, at the moment, it's sort of still under wraps, and we can't actually give you a copy, but we can talk you through the ideas and the main principles of that. So basically, some of the critical things are, it is treated, the Indigenous research data is treated a little bit differently. One of the critical elements to think about, and something you might like to consider immediately before you chat with us, is communication with the community, and in relation to how you will manage and access any data that is collected in relation to them. So really important to consider. As part of this, which also might help in terms of what you might need to consider, is what we're calling the CARE principles. So what that, and it's an acronym, so what that stands for is the collective benefit for Indigenous peoples. If you're collecting this data, how do they benefit from this? They retain the authority to control the data. So if they decide to pull the pin, even if you are 2 weeks from publishing, they have that right. So please, that's something that we need to consider. The responsibility, so in terms of sharing, what can and can't be shared, it might be that there's elements that can be, and there's elements that need to be locked away from a broad sharing aspect. And also thinking about the ethics in terms of the rights and the well-being of the Indigenous community on which some of this information has been obtained from, or could influence from that side. So it is something that it's becoming I guess more, I feel that we're doing more work in, but it's also something that we do need to be very careful about how we deal with this and be respectful. So that's the end of this particular section. Just wondering if there are any questions that have come up. You can always ask at the end. Don't feel the pressure to ask right now, but are there any questions before I hand over to Jenny to do the next bit?
No questions in the chat so far. Would anyone like to unmute and ask any questions for this point?
That's okay. We can always come back at the end. Thank you much, Lynn. I'll hand over to Jenny to continue.
Thanks, Nicole, and hello, everyone. So I'm going to be looking at a couple of different aspects of data. The first one is, why is it important to manage your data well? So data management as a whole. So managing your research data and associated documentation is essential to assuring the success of your research, but there will also be elements after you've completed the project that make that the really well structured data management important. You've got to make sure that you're maintaining reliable and accurate data throughout the process. Planning for your data management, the management of your research data at the beginning of the research project will save you time and help you avoid any disasters such as loss, corruption of data, inability to reuse the data due to errors or lack of contextual information. So making sure that it's reliable and accurate throughout that process is really important. The other point there, data reproducibility. Once you've got all this data, it is important that you and other people can reproduce it easily. Same with any of your literature searches or any of those sorts of things. It has to be reproducible to be considered to be rigorous research. So data is no different. Making sure that you've got everything documented in a really well structured way is going to help you to share, and that data will be reused in all kinds of ways. So it's going to, having that accurate data is also going to help to increase the impact and visibility of your research, because more and more people can engage with it. It will be then shared in all sorts of different ways. So it's you that's being acknowledged as the person who created this data, and therefore your profile is being raised through all of this, but you're ensuring that your research through this data is also becoming impactful and engaged with and visible. If you've also created a data management plan of some sort, you can make sure that you're going to have good data security and risk of data loss reduced as much as possible, because you've incorporated that into some sort of plan that you've looked at. And what you want to be doing is clearly stating the things about who owns the data. If there's a team of you working on something, who is going to be looking after that, who's going to be responsible for managing that data during and after the project. These kinds of things also meet publisher and funder requirements as well. They want to know that you have got a good structured data management plan in order to make sure you can tick the box on all of these things that I've just talked about. But also having something that's well described is also another way of being able to share the data and increase collaboration and opportunities for more funding in the future. Next slide, thanks Anthony. So they're just all things to consider. And then a few more considerations with your data management. What kind of information have you got? As Nicole just touched on, Indigenous data is really important to be treated with respect and care, and following the care principles of the collective benefit, the authority to control, the responsibility and the ethics. Those sorts of things need to be considered when you're putting together a data management plan. But there's also other sensitive information that might be incorporated into your data, such as medical or personal. Sensitive corporate information is something that you've got to be considering as well. How are you going to protect that? And is there a likelihood that any of those things might be shared in some other way? So you need to be sure that you've created some sort of strategy about what's going to happen with this information. Make sure that you're storing and archiving the information, backing it up, making copies. You're probably all aware now that you don't keep your thesis just in one place with one copy of your EndNote library anywhere. It's the same with data. Make sure you've got backups and copies in multiple places, just to mitigate against any problems that might arise with, you know, your computer or lightning strikes at home or whatever. So it's being sure that you're storing and archiving that, but also consider the long-term storage and preservation of that data. How is somebody in the future going to be able to access that data? And being aware of what your alternatives are in where you can be storing and preserving that data. And making sure that it's accessible and reusable as well. Once you've done the backup and the copying, are other people able to access it fairly easily, or do they need some extra instructions on how to access it? So think about all of those things when you're putting together your data management plan. You've also got to think of any legislative and ethical requirements that might be involved in any of that kind of research that, again, goes back to being sensitive or something to do with, you know, Indigenous research. So being aware of all of those things at the beginning, but also throughout. The data management plan can be changing and moving throughout the process, but having some sort of plan is really important. Just going back to the access idea of people accessing your data, if you are putting any of your research into an open access environment, you want to make sure that that information is okay to be in an open access environment. Is there anything out there that is going to create any issues if somebody else is sharing it and accessing it? The university has produced a guide on getting things done, which incorporates information about this, you know, your data management. A couple of other things to consider is medical research, research done on humans, research done on animals. Each of those will have some kind of requirement associated with it, and the university has got guidelines on any of those things. So just make sure that you're checking out any of the requirements that go along with managing your data. Now, I saw that Krista had a message.
Yes, I was just going to say, Jenny, before we move on, I think this is actually a good time to pause and answer Krista's question. So she's asked a question specifically around sensitive data, example, when you're working with children who identify a past adverse event and then keeping that data safe. Krista, did you want to unmute and maybe give us a little bit of information there?
Yep, you're still on mute, Krista. Yep, there you go.
Right now, yes. I'll be working with kids in schools with challenging behaviour. Many of them will have had past trauma or current trauma. And I guess my concern is, I know that there are going to be events possibly that I might have to pass on to the authorities in terms of anything that they talk about that's criminal. But what I mean here is because I'm doing semi-structured interviews in order to develop a particular neurocognitive intervention to assist them to manage their behaviour, they're going to be providing me possibly with sensitive information about why they are in this state in the first place, what sort of adverse events like trauma or domestic violence have actually affected them. So that's going to be part of my data, because it'll be fundamental to deciding for each of those individuals in a group exactly what kind of strategies are going to work for them to make them more self-aware and help them manage their behaviour. So I'm very concerned about that, because it's going to be very difficult for some of those kids.
So, Anthony,
does that make it clearer or not?
Yes, it does.
Yes. Okay.
I mean, I'm happy to take input from Jenny and Nicole here, who actually are working in the research space, but just from my awareness of policies and things we have at the university, I do some of the things we've already touched on around the policies that the university has around research. They have quite good guidelines around ethical use of materials and things like that. I think that's probably a good place to check. Okay. More generally, I think making sure that you de-identify any data that's being kept is a good way of keeping that safe and secure. Yep. How you actually structure that with your own research for follow-ups and things like that, I guess is probably something you'd need to maybe have a chat with perhaps the ethics committee, or at least consult the ethics policy around, just so that you know if you have to follow up with somebody about a particular adverse event. But yes, de-identification would be key here, and checking out those policies. Nicole and Jenny, was there anything else you'd like to?
No, I was going to say the de-identifying as much as possible, but then also referring, getting in touch with the ethics committee and see if they've got any other suggestions. But the de-identification of things.
Yeah, well, I've set that in place. My ethics are actually before the board at the moment, but I guess what I'm thinking is there's always, because it's a small group that I'm working with in the first place, you know, de-identifying is not the be-all and the end-all in terms of other people like teachers and other stakeholders knowing specifically who that child is. So because you were talking about different storage repositories, I guess I just wanted to make absolutely sure that it would be safe, or whether it's even appropriate for that to be stored, you know, in an open access facility.
I'm just thinking the way to get, I totally understand where you're coming from, and the fact, especially a small pool, the chances of someone working out who's who is unfortunately fairly large. But what you can do in something like Nova is actually just get a record put up and ask people if they wish to see the data, they need to get in touch with you. So there's an element of screening that can happen there, from the aspect of saying, I don't think it's appropriate for you to have access to the data. What you're looking to do with it is not in the it's not keeping with the idea of the project in the first place. So you could still, so I wouldn't say don't share it. I would just simply, you could put up a summary. You haven't got to mention place names. You could just be a very general set of statements about what's in, what the information is about, so that, i.e., people know that it's been done, that you get acknowledgement for that, but you're not then, I guess, breaking the trust that you will end up no doubt developing with the students that are involved, because they'll be telling you stuff. There'll be an element of a relationship of sorts will form there, so that you can maintain that.
Okay.
Just to be clear too, when we are talking about storage and access, there's internal access that would be for your research group only, and then there's that kind of external access where we actually, make it open to the world. So as Nicole said, yeah, it's about it's about simplifying the data down in some cases. So instead of actually naming the school, you could say, a small school in rural New South Wales, for example.
In a general summary, man, because I have already coded the schools, so yeah.
Yeah, anything that would be problematic as far as, easily identifying the participants, obviously you would remove that from the data that you make open.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I'm just going to mute myself and I'll hand back over to Jenny.
Thanks. Yeah. Keep asking us the questions though as you go, Krista, because I know that you've asked me about some of these things previously. But yeah, keep coming back to us. Ask the ethics committee as well what their ideas are, and anybody else who has done this kind of research will be able to give you lots of ideas as well. Thanks, Krista. Okay, so the next thing is any of the processes that you would want to be confirming and further planning in your data management. So the Nh Mrc recommends the development of a data management plan as soon as possible in the research process, and you should be including at least some of the following. So you're wanting to make sure that the physical network, the system security, and any other technologically secure measurements are taken to ensure that is, all of your data is secure. Making sure that any policies and procedures, any contractual and licensing agreements associated with the project and the data and its management are being followed or looked at. Be familiar with what you're supposed to be doing with all of the management of your data. Do you need to be training members of the project team and others to look after the data as well? So there's sometimes things that you would want to be thinking about beforehand. The form in which the data or the information is going to be stored or used or disclosed or shared. Think about those sorts of things when you're planning your data management project as a whole. And what kind of information from the data management plan, if any, needs to be communicated with any of the other participants as well. A data management plan will always be a living document, and that's going to be describing how the research data and associated materials are being created and managed and stored and documented and secured throughout that entire research project. So you also want to be planning for what will happen to the data and the materials after you've completed the project as well. You'll also want to be sure of who's going to own and access that data and what kind of equipment and facilities are going to be used. So there are all kinds of things that you want to be thinking about when you're thinking about how the data is going to be managed. So you've got physical, you've got policies, you've got the people in your team. Are there any kind of contractual or licensing or confidentiality agreements and processes and protocols that have to be followed? So it's just keeping in mind all of these things that need to be looked at as far as keeping your data safe and secure and shareable and reusable and all those wonderful things. There is a question, or that's still Krista's. Yep. Okay, so the next lot is thinking about the metadata, the data that talks about the data and its description. So what you want to be doing whenever you're creating a data management plan is to make sure that everybody understands what you've used and how they can understand. So I'm getting my words mixed up here. So I guess the data management plan describes the retention and the disposal and the archiving and the accessing and the sharing and the publishing, all those sorts of things, but also being able to create easily identifiable data, making sure that the file naming conventions are consistent. Everybody knows what the labeling means, where the folders are, how the folders are labeled. All those things need to be consistent across the entire project. And those sorts of things can be added into your data management plan as well. What kinds of data formats and versioning are you going to be using? Because you need to be thinking about long-term access. Using standard file formats is always the best way to go, because it means that anybody can come and reuse that data at a later stage. They don't need to understand or use some other format that's beyond you know, the known. So using things like plain text, something that's unencrypted, something that's uncompressed, is going to mean that that data can be accessed by a range of people, you know, in a range of different places. Making sure that the folders are structured and in a consistent, logical way as well. Making sure that the dating, things like dates are consistent, the vocabulary that is being used is understood, and if the vocabulary is not understood, there needs to be some sort of explanation. So with the medical databases, they use the example there, MESH, which is the medical subject headings, which can be a bit confusing if you're not familiar with medical subject headings. The ARDC have the research vocabularies listed there, which will make it a lot easier for people to come back and understand what you've used, if it is just something slightly left of field that is not used by everybody. Making sure that all of your data is interoperable. It can be integrated with other data. The data needs to be able to interoperate with lots of different applications and workflows for analysis and storing and processing. So you're thinking about lots of the bigger things, but you're also having to come in and make sure these smaller things, the metadata that sits behind everything, is consistent, is explained, is able to be used by other people, and is interoperable with any kind of other software. And that's it from me. Are there any questions? No? All good. Well, I'll hand over to Anthony.
It's all right. I was just fighting Zoom trying to unmute myself there. No, there's no extra questions at this point. So we're going to move into the copyright side of things a bit more. We have touched on a little bit of things around IP and some kind of access and things like that. So I'm going to talk about some specific kind of uses of data and things like that within copyright. So more recently, lots and lots of people are working in kind of data scraping and data mining processes to be able to conduct their research. And that's, again, something that, you know, is quite easily collected and kind of worked with sometimes. And it really is a kind of an interesting space to be in at the moment with research. So just to be clear, under the Australian copyright legislation, the Copyright Act 1968, there's no official exception in the Act, so no kind of allowance that specifically allows for data mining or data scraping. So I promise that I help I'd actually stop at this point and explain what the two are as well. So quite often people use data mining and data scraping interchangeably, but they are technically separate processes. So scraping is the kind of initial collection or extracting of data from sources. So it might be from websites, you might be running it across multiple articles or documents and things like that. And you know, even if you're in the Hass field, you might be running it through original source documents, things like that, to pull out what you're looking for. That's the kind of scraping. And then when you move into data mining, it actually includes scraping as an initial process, but the mining process itself is more like the finding the patterns within these data sets that you've extracted from the various locations. So that's kind of how those two fit together, even though, like I said, some people do use them a little bit interchangeably, but scraping is technically the start of the process, whereas mining is looking at the actual useful stuff that you've scraped and you've put it together. But just because there's no official exception in the Act doesn't mean that, you know, it's naughty, don't do it. But I will say it is kind of a gray area, and I did kind of choose the color of this slide on purpose, gray for gray. So in the Copyright Act, we do have these exceptions that fall under the banner of what's called fair dealing. So just to be very careful with this, fair use, which some people have usually heard of, actually comes from the US, and that's very different. That's from their copyright legislation in the US. Fair dealing is what we have here in Australia. It's much more restrictive. But on the other hand, because it's more defined as well, it's actually easier to understand for most people. So we do have a couple of exceptions, which I'll talk about on another slide, that, and the keyword there is may be able to be relied on for research use, assuming that you don't already have a license for this. And the reason why I mentioned licensing there is some databases, for example, that we have access to actually allow you to do data scraping on their content. Sometimes you can do it straight away. Sometimes you need to ask them and they will provide you with a specific data set that you can then mine from. So yeah, so fair dealing is reasonably broad, and it may allow, depending on what you want to do, and again, I'll touch more on that in a minute. So one of the key things to remember, though, is that fair dealing does not cover reproduction, like direct reproduction of content. So if you wanted to, say, scrape specific lines of songs, for example, just thinking about some of the things I've been asked about recently, and then you wanted to actually reproduce those song lines or lyrics directly in your research, that would not be covered under fair dealing. So aggregated findings are always a good way to go. So summaries, aggregation, and where data is actually copyrighted, it can be very interesting, i.e. difficult to get those reproduction rights. So just to give you an idea of something there, I was made aware of some researchers, not at this institution, but elsewhere from talking to colleagues, where they had done a whole heap of research based around what types of food items were being heavily promoted in supermarket catalogs. So, you know, from your Coles, your Woolies. So they were looking at the amount of foods that were high fat, high sugar, high calorie type things, and they did a lot of data mining on that. And then they came up with all this great research, and they actually wanted to be able to reproduce things from the catalogs as part of their research, because it makes sense. You've drawn all the stuff from these things. You've got your lovely aggregated data, but they want to be able to reproduce it too, just to reinforce some of that research they've been doing. And of course, the supermarkets were absolutely horrified and went, no. So they weren't able to put the research out the way they had planned, and they had to kind of do a little bit of a spin and have a rethink about how they were approaching things. So this is also important, where, just to touch back on what Jenny and Nicole talked about with the data plan. So thinking about how you're actually going to use the material that comes out of your research can be folded into that, and thinking about, do we need to get any kind of reproduction rights from any copyright owners from data that we've scraped or mined. So just something additional to think about along with those other dot points we've had.
Anthony, we've just got a question from Krista.
Mm-hmm.
So would this fair dealing provision also cover medical imagery, e.g. brain imagery?
That's an interesting thing. So, Krista, did you want to give me a little bit more information there?
Yes, I will be using quite a bit of description and around brain function and brain wiring. And so I'll be using some of the imagery that is already being used in medical circles. And I may also have to use things like prints from fMRIs and things like that. So that's really what I wanted to know about.
Sure, sure. So fair dealing is usually considered for, it's usually considered for personal, but that's kind of misleading in a research way, because usually it's not personal, it's kind of done as a group, but it's that kind of, think internal group research use. It doesn't tend to cover publication use. So say, for example, the imagery you were planning on using was already published in a book or a journal article or something like that. You'd need to get permission from the copyright owners to reproduce that. If you take the images yourself or are granted permission to use existing images from your work that you're doing out in the field, those kinds of things don't tend to rely on fair dealing. They rely on some other kind of permission or your own ownership of them.
Right.
So yeah, fair dealing is more for use. It doesn't tend to be for reproduction.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Before you go on, Anthony,
yes.
I guess the critical message for Krista is to get anything in writing. If you need to get permissions and that sort of stuff, please get them in writing, just so that A, you know what you've got permission, how you can use it, but then also B, if someone else comes back later and goes, oh, but we didn't let you do that, you've got something explaining, you can, you've got a point in which to start a discussion about how things are being done.
Exactly, yes. And, you know, things you take yourself, you tend to have ownership of, unless you're doing it as sometimes if you do it in a professional capacity, your organization may own it. But again, that's discussions you can have in those kind of spaces to work out who owns what and what can you do with these images. So yeah. Just continuing on with what I touched on a little bit earlier about the actual process. So as I mentioned, fair dealing doesn't cover reproduction, or if it does, it covers a very limited amount. So the process that you're using around your data scraping and data mining here is really important. So for most people, it's just a collection of material, or it might be a small amount of reproduction. So if it's just accessing and there's very limited reproduction involved, you usually covered it. Sorry, I need to make sure I keep this vague here because it's being recorded. You may be covered under fair dealing. So if you do ever have any concerns about this, please always reach out and we can talk about it. I've had a lot of discussions recently with people where they've walked me through their actual processes, and I've said, yeah, that's no, that's bad from a copyright perspective, or yeah, you're not actually reproducing anything here. It's just a technical process, and that's actually allowed for under the Act. So always reach out if you're unsure. So we talked about storage and access previously and around a lot of things. So a lot of the data material that you may be scraping or using for your mining, you may be able to store them locally for local use within your research group, but sharing them outside of that group may be an issue. So again, that's something to think about when it comes to how you're going to be sharing data. And good rule of thumb is that the more data sources you're accessing, the more likely you're going to trip over some kind of issue with copyright. So sit down and think, like, do I really need to be doing this? Do I really need to be reproducing this? How are we accessing this material? And that can help save some headaches a little bit later. And again, if ever you're unsure, please reach out. We're more than happy to have discussions and help people kind of navigate their way through. Just to be clear too, as copyright advisor, I'm unable to provide legal advice, just to be clear. I'm not a lawyer, but I do work quite heavily in a lot of research spaces and licensing and other spaces as well. So we can kind of talk from that experience perspective. And if I feel like you'd be better off, you know, having actual legal advice, I'll refer you on appropriately. Just wanted to get that on the recording. So just to touch back on those fair dealing exceptions. So the two that a lot of researchers are able to lean into, research or study is the big one, as you would expect. And the other one that may occasionally rear its head is criticism or review. So a lot of people, though, wouldn't be more likely to rely on that research or study one. So as I mentioned, it's kind of individual type use, even though it does also apply to research groups. So it doesn't cover that reproduction side of things. You can copy a certain percentage of material. It's usually around about 10%. So if your processes are reproducing up to about 10% of material, that's usually considered okay under fair dealing. Interestingly enough, just for the students that are in the room, you can rely on fair dealing for research or study to reproduce content in any accessible tasks that you have, but it doesn't cover your thesis use. So keep that in mind. Researchers, again, may be able to rely on this for their needs. But as I've mentioned, because people always ask, it doesn't cover any kind of use in formal publishing. So it won't cover you for journal articles, for conference papers, for reports, or anything else that you want to put out. It only covers the actual research process and use within the research, not the final product or final outcome output, whether that's a publication or an NTRO for that matter. So we have talked about open data a little bit. So just to reiterate that point from earlier, wherever we talk about open data, this is the final, very, very cleaned, very de-identified version that is safe to be shared and isn't going to identify or cause distress for the participants, or for that matter, those involved in the research. So open data is generally seen as a great thing because it gives access to people that may not be able to reproduce the same kind of cohort studies or whatever it is you're involved in. The key word there, I guess, on that top dot point is the transparency. There's been a real push in recent years for transparency in research, and by making your data open and available, it helps to show that you've done that scholarly rigor process, that you've done that kind of integrity, that you've met those ethics needs, for example, that we keep talking about. So it's a good way of showing that you've done the right thing and ticked all the boxes as far as your research goes. I've heard quite a few stories from people about, they've made their data open, and they've had researchers from overseas reach out and like, oh, this is actually something I'm really interested in. Would you like to, collaborate on something together? Or, we actually took a slightly different tack with the research we did, and we did it this way. And that person went, oh, we didn't consider the way you've approached it. I'm going to take my own data and then run the same process that you've done against my data, and then I'll get a new publication out of it. So it's a good way of getting that collaboration out there, putting it out into the world, and involving others in it. And I guess that third dot point there is one that everybody that's working in the research space wants. It gets your profile out there. The more papers that you're able to get out of the data from the different texts that you do, the more citations that you get, it raises your profile. It improves your chances for maybe some additional funding. It might help your chances of getting some promotions in the academic world. So it's always something good to think about. The other thing too is, we've talked about this a few times, as part of the publication or funding processes that are kind of behind your research, it may be a requirement for those as well. I think it was Nicole specifically mentioned the Nh Mrc, how they've now removed the embargo for research data, and as soon as your publication comes out, your research data needs to go up there with it as well, out into the world. So make sure that you're always looking at that, and the more open you can be with your research, usually the better it is for you overall. And as we've already talked about, we have the Nova repository, which I'm just going to skip out just to show you if I can actually work out what I've done with it. Where is it? Is it that one? There we go. Okay, so for those that haven't seen it before, Nova is our open research repository. So we have talked about this a few times, but there's some data sets here specifically that I've linked to, and you can see there's people from all across the university and different research aspects that have, or focuses that have gone up and put this all out. So that's something that you can do quite easily. You can send that through to Nova and they'll put it up. And again, reminder, this is the safe for public consumption version of your data, not necessarily the internal stuff that you've been working on.
Anthony, do you want to just put that link in the chat? Because I think Krista was looking closely at the tiny writing on the screen.
Oh, sure. This
will give you the link to the
that's
page,
the link that
Krista.
I'm using, but for those that are watching the recording, it will actually be on the slides and you can get access to it that way. So these are the data sets there. But you can also, just to give a little plug for Nova while we are here, it's not just about open data, it's about open research in general. So you can, you know, if you've got journal articles, we can help you put those up. Conference papers, any type of publication. There's also the option, as Nicole mentioned, where if we can't make it open access, we can at least have a metadata record in there that can help people find it and help them identify you as the creator. And then maybe that can still assist with, you know, communication and collaboration and that side of things as well. Even if we can't make it open, we can still have an open record that will help people to find it. So yes, I should disclaim some biases here. I previously did work with the Nova repository, and it was great to be able to interact with researchers and get their research out into the world and help them with things like, you know, funding and those academic promotions and things like that. So the way we do open data is usually through open licensing of some sort. So a lot of people have heard of Creative Commons. That's a big one in the research and other spaces, and that's very easy to understand. And Creative Commons licenses give the copyright owner or the creator, because they're not always the same thing, the control to hold on to their copyright while still kind of baking in certain permissions. So you might allow somebody to use the data however they want, as long as they credit your original data, or you might place limitations on, you know, they can't use it for commercial purposes and things like that. There are other forms of open licensing as well. So if you're working with software and those kind of coding spaces, there's the GNU General Public License, or GPL, that's out there as well. And certain research organizations have their own, like MIT, the institution over in America, they have their own open licensing and all kinds of things. So there are lots out there. But yeah, if people do ask me, I do tend to recommend Creative Commons, just because it's easy to find the licensing arrangements, and it's very, very easy to work out which will be the right license for you as well. So these open licenses, because you're already baking in the permissions that you want people to have, end users know exactly how they can share them, how they're able to reuse them, and it makes it really, really simple. So every one of, well, it's pretty standard with open licensing, and especially with Creative Commons, that the minimum requirement for usage is an attribution. So they have to give you credit, and then they have to usually provide details of the licensing that's involved as well. So one key thing to do, just because there are so many different forms of open licensing, the terms of the licenses will vary even within particular subsets like Creative Commons. So always make sure that you look closely at what the reuse options are, both for yourself when you're reusing open license materials, and also what you're granting to other people. Because once you attach an open license, it's basically out into the world and you can't actually retract the license. You can, it is possible to actually pull down content. So say, for example, you put it up under one license and you realize that you weren't quite restrictive enough, you can pull it back down, but anybody that's accessed that material under that open license can continue to use it under that license. But there are ways that you can do multiple versions of the same thing. Like we've had researchers here put out one version under an open license, and then they do a better kind of cleaned up, neat, more official looking version that they put out under all rights reserved copyright. So your standard kind of copyright. So just before I move on, I can see that I think it's Krista again has asked a question here. How would you protect your research information when approached, example by CIFAL, to develop micro-learning videos of your work? So when you apply an open license, these have legal backing behind them. So if you say, for example, go and Google Creative Commons CC BY, so that's the kind of most open of their license, it's the attribution license, that has a whole legal code that sits behind it. So these things are essentially defendable in court if you need to. So if you need to litigate, you've got that legal backing. So it's not just a case of, oh, I'm throwing my stuff out there and people can do whatever. You get to choose what restrictions you place on it. And then that licensing has a background. So as far as developing micro videos of your work, so you keep the copyright. If you already own the copyright in this material, which is usually the case with data, and you apply an open license to it, that doesn't mean you've given your copyright away. You get to keep your copyright, you get to keep any moral rights, all that type of stuff that are associated with it. I might have to continue on, unfortunately, Krista, just to get through the rest of this, but please, if you need more information, please follow up. So just to reinforce, so if you do need help with your research, please reach out to a research liaison librarian, and the links are there. We also have some online support materials for researchers, and there's a whole heap. And support for copyright, you can ask me a question via that link there, newcastle.edu.au/copyright-request. And then there's a whole heap of online documents and new support for researchers that I've recently added up at /copyright-support. Any other questions? And Krista, like I said, if you would like more information about your last question, please reach out. Unfortunately, I had to cut it off just for timing. But if nobody else has any other questions, I'll just hold this up for the recording. So all of these sessions that we do, we're very keen to hear your feedback. We have a form there that you can fill out. I think it's only got a couple of questions. So newcastle.libwizard.com/F for form /researcherHDR. So all responses are anonymous and it only takes a couple of minutes. So we'd be very, very grateful if you could fill that out to let us know anything that you'd like to see or provide feedback for what we've done.